They tried to erase us, but they forgot. DNA remembers.
What if everything you were told about being Mexican was only part of the truth? We grow up hearing the same story that we're all one race now. La Raza Cosmica. A powerful blend, a proud Mestizo nation. But when scientists looked deeper, when they read the blood instead of the textbooks, they found something no one expected. Not unity, but extremes. In 2014, a genetic team at Stanford and UCSF scanned the DNA of indigenous groups from across the country. What they found shattered the myth of sameness. The Seri people in the Sonoran Desert and the Lacandan Maya in the southern jungle were as genetically distant from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. Let that sink in. Two peoples from the same country, speaking different tongues, living under one flag, but their genes are strangers to each other. And then came the Mexico City prospective study in 2023, over 140,000 individuals tested. The average person? About 66% indigenous ancestry. But average is a lie that hides 1,000 truths. Because some carried barely 10% and others nearly 90%. So what does it really mean to be Mexican when your DNA could trace to Aztec emperors, African slaves, Spanish conquistadors, or Asian sailors from across the Pacific? What if your family's proud tales of Castilian ancestors were only 1/3 of the story and the rest had been silenced? There's a reason why so many people take a DNA test expecting one thing and come out questioning everything. Because under the skin there's a storm of migrations, whispers of forgotten tribes' entire lineages that weren't erased, just ignored. And somewhere beneath the volcanic soil of central Mexico, archaeologists brushed dust off a human skull, one that had lain buried for 2,000 years. What they found inside that bone in a tiny loop of mitochondrial DNA would begin to unravel the clean story we thought we knew. Because that skull didn't match the people who lived there when the Spanish came. In fact, it didn't match anyone at all. Not until modern-day Mexicans started testing their DNA and discovering they were related. That's when the bones began to whisper. And that's when the grave at Xaltocan stopped being an archaeological site and started becoming a mirror. Xaltocan, once a powerful pre-Aztec city just north of modern-day Mexico City, had been reduced to ruins by the time Cortés marched inland in 1519. But centuries earlier, around 1000 CE, it was thriving. Its people were farmers, artisans, builders of temples and canals. And its women quietly, unknowingly carried a genetic legacy that would outlast empires. In 2004, when archaeologists excavated a cluster of graves at the site, they recovered fragments of ancient mitochondrial DNA passed from mother to daughter without fail. What they found was staggering. The mtDNA matched haplogroup A lineage that originated over 10,000 years ago in far Northeast Asia, likely Siberia. It crossed into the Americas through the Bering Land Bridge, surviving in silence across millennia, and here it was, still alive, in 21st century Mexicans. One woman buried there 2,300 years ago carried the exact same maternal markers as women living today in Tlaxcala, Puebla, and parts of the Yucatan. A direct line, unbroken by time, conquest, or forgetting. But the story twisted again. When the Mexica, the Aztecs, rose to power in the 1400s, they conquered Xaltocan. Records from the post-conquest Codex Mendoza describe how defeated cities were resettled. New women were brought in. Original lineages faded from view. Archaeologists saw it in the bones the matrilines changed. Yet modern DNA shows those older lines survived elsewhere. Quiet, hidden, waiting. This wasn't just a family tree. It was proof. Long before Spanish ships arrived, indigenous bloodlines were already being erased not by colonizers, but by their own rising empires. And that truth, buried beneath dust and forgotten history, exploded when modern scientists ran full genome sequencing. Suddenly, haplogroups A and C weren't just in central Mexico. They appeared in Aridoamerica, Mesoamerica, even the highlands. It wasn't a nation. It was a constellation, a map of ancient migrations drawn in the genome. And in that moment, the silence of Xaltocan cracked. Because the next wave of erasure wasn't going to come with obsidian blades. It would come with steel, fire, and names no one had ever heard before. Names like Cortés, Veracruz, España. And with them came the most permanent mixture of all. Because when the Spanish stepped onto the shores of Veracruz in April 1519, they didn't just arrive with muskets and horses. They brought a force far more lasting than steel. They brought chromosomes. Hernán Cortés, a name etched in every history book, came not with a nation, but with 500 men. No wives, no sisters, no daughters. Only soldiers, clergy, and ambition. Within 2 years, they'd burned Tenochtitlan to the ground. But what they planted would live much longer than fire. They wrote treaties with ink and rewrote ancestry with flesh. Today, when geneticists study the Y chromosomes of Mexican Mestizo men, the signal is undeniable. Nearly 65% European, specifically Iberian. The lineage of soldiers from Andalusia, sailors from Extremadura, merchants from La Mancha. That means 2 out of every 3 paternal lines in modern Mexico trace back to men who arrived not as natives but as invaders. Because the truth is uncomfortable. In the 16th century, Spanish women were almost entirely absent from New Spain. The colonial registers show it, marriage licenses show it, church archives whisper it. So how did the Spanish leave such a deep genetic footprint? The answer lies in the power imbalance. In conquest disguised as kinship. In alliances made through forced baptisms, and bodies that could not refuse. Indigenous women, thousands of them, became mothers to a new population, and their children bore Spanish names, even when their faces did not. But that was only the first layer. In the 18th century, another Iberian tide arrived, Canary Islanders sent by the crown to populate key regions like Texas and Yucatan. Then came the 1930s. The Spanish Civil War tore through Iberia, and Mexico opened its arms. Thousands fled Franco's regime and resettled in Veracruz, Mexico City, Guadalajara. Artists, scientists, nobility stripped of land, but not of genes. Their DNA stacked on top of what Cortés began. Not one conquest, but many. Not one wave, but generations. And so, buried in the cells of modern Mexicans, are surnames never spoken, bloodlines never remembered, legacies wrapped in silence, pride, and shame. But if some came for land, others were brought for labor. Because not all ships sailed with flags. Some sailed with chains. Between 1521 and 1810, more than 200,000 Africans were trafficked into New Spain, a number so large, it once made colonial Mexico the second largest slaveholding territory under Spanish rule. Not Brazil, not the Caribbean, Veracruz, Acapulco, Campeche, silent shores, hiding broken voices. They were labeled cargo, bought, sold, branded. Their names erased, their lineages scattered. But their blood? Their blood remained. In places like Tamiahua, Veracruz modern DNA studies uncovered something shocking. 40.5% African ancestry in local populations. Not 2%, not 5, 40. And yet, in the 2020 national census, less than 2% of Mexicans identified as Afro-descendants. How does a whole nation forget one of its 3 founding roots? This isn't accidental. Colonial records buried it under caste labels mulatto, zombo, morisco. Skin color ranked like currency. By the late 1700s, entire towns with majority Afro populations were reclassified as Mestizo by royal decree. The term Afro-Mexican? It barely existed in law or memory until 1992, when the Mexican government, at last, formally acknowledged African heritage as la tercera raíz, the third root. But by then, it was already silent. Families who carried the DNA had no names, no stories, no trace. Only faint whispers, a darker complexion, a certain rhythm in music, a rumor no one repeated, until DNA cracked it open. In recent years, personal tests through companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA began revealing the unspoken. People with 5%, 10%, even 20% sub-Saharan ancestry from ancestors no one ever mentioned. One case from Puebla, a family traced pure Spanish descent back 6 generations, until a church record from 1798 revealed a grandmother listed simply as una mulata esclava, a woman written out of memory, rediscovered in a genome. It wasn't just slavery that erased her, it was silence. And still, science keeps revealing more. Autosomal analysis now shows traces of African haplogroups across nearly every Mexican state, even in places where no one talks about it. Because history can lie, but the body cannot. And while one root was erased, another root from across the Pacific was arriving in secret. No chains, no glory, no name, just a whisper in the genes, and a story no one ever thought to ask. Because while ships from Spain carried chains and conquest, others crossed the Pacific in silence. From 1,565 to 1,815, the Manila galleon trade connected the Spanish colony of the Philippines with New Spain. Once a year, a single ship left Manila loaded with silk, spices, ivory, and people. Sailors, servants, slaves. Most were Southeast Asians Filipino, Malay, Indonesian, often mislabeled in records as chinos, sometimes treated as cargo, sometimes vanished from the ledgers entirely. They docked in Acapulco. They vanished into the streets of Guerrero. And for centuries, no one asked what became of them. Until DNA cracked open the silence again. In 2022, geneticist Juan Rodriguez and his team published a study that turned eyebrows into gasps. They found clear East and Southeast Asian ancestry, particularly in coastal Guerrero, dating back 13 generations. That's around 1,600 to 1,650 CE. The legacy was clearest in mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line suggesting that many of these Asian migrants were women. Women who were absorbed into Mexican society through servitude, marriage, or force. Women whose children never knew they were different, until the genome said otherwise. The highest signals, up to 2.3% Asian ancestry, were found in Guerrero, a state already known for its indigenous resilience and African echoes. Now, it spoke Tagalog. It remembered coconut rice. It hummed lullabies no one had written down. But these weren't just isolated signals. They were fingerprints of forgotten crossings, a quiet migration no textbook ever placed on the map. Some were enslaved during the early Spanish Pacific campaigns. Others were convicts or crew members left behind. Some fled forced Catholic conversions in the Philippines and found themselves baptized again in Mexican churches. They became part of the cast, but not of the narrative. Their names were erased, their accents dissolved, but the DNA didn't forget. And as modern Mexicans tested their blood, they found matches in Manila, in Jakarta, in the islands of the South China Sea, because history didn't just divide continents, it crisscrossed them. And inside Mexico itself, it didn't just mix cultures, it split chromosomes. And depending on where you were born, your genome could tell a completely different story. In the northern deserts of Sonora, geneticists found something striking on average: 61.6% European ancestry. Pale skin, green eyes, surnames that echo Andalusian towns. But travel 1,500 kilometers south to Tlapa, Guerrero, and it flips. Over 98% native ancestry, as if Spain never reached them, as if they never left the pre-Columbian world. And that's not an exaggeration. In a study by Moreno Estrada et al., 2014, researchers mapped over 1 million genetic markers across Mexico. What they found wasn't a gradient, it was a patchwork. Entire regions, separated not just by distance, but by history. And those histories were written in isolation. Tlapa, nestled deep in the Sierra Madre del Sur, was never fully conquered. The terrain protected it, mountains too treacherous for Spanish cavalry, villages too remote for Catholic missions. The Nahua, Mixtec, and Tlapanec communities resisted not just through weapons, but through genetics. They married each other, they stayed, and they passed their genome down untouched. Meanwhile, In Sonora, colonization came fast and hard. The silver mines of Alamos and Arizpe drew waves of Spanish settlers. Soldiers and priests followed. By the 1700s, mestizaje wasn't a theory, it was reality. And over generations, native ancestry faded beneath layers of European chromosomes. But here's the twist. It's not just regional, it's urban. In Mexico City today, one neighborhood can carry 21% European ancestry and the next street over 70%. Not because of luck, but because of class, wealth, migration. The barrio you're born in determines which ancestors you inherited more of and which ones were forgotten. DNA doesn't lie, but it's also not random. It's a mirror that reflects centuries of labor routes, land policies, intermarriage, and colonial strategies. Because in Mexico, geography wasn't just landscape, it was destiny. But even more shocking was what the genome revealed when scientists split the data by sex. Because your mother's DNA and your father's didn't just come from different people. They came from different sides of history. It's called sex-biased admixture. A sterile term, but behind it, centuries of power, violence, and survival. In genetic studies from the Instituto Nacional de Medicina Genómica and others between 2009 and 2023, one pattern appears again and again. 85 to 90% of mitochondrial DNA, the mother line, is indigenous, but most of the Y chromosomes, the father line, are European. This isn't coincidence. This is colonization under a microscope. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they didn't bring families. They brought men, soldiers, friars, bureaucrats. The earliest censuses of New Spain, like the 1520s encomienda lists, show a world of male settlers. But someone bore the next generation. It was indigenous women, sometimes by marriage, often not, through coercion, through imposed alliances, through systems that collapsed native sovereignty but absorbed native bodies. These women became the silent carriers of a new population, their bloodlines preserved, even when their names were erased. The genome doesn't hide it. Take a sample from central Mexico today, you're likely to find a Native American mtDNA haplogroup, like A2 or C1. But the Y chromosome? Often R1b, the same dominant European male haplogroup seen in Spain, France, and parts of Western Europe. And this pattern goes beyond the Spanish. In coastal regions like Veracruz and Guerrero, African DNA tells a similar tale. Autosomal studies show sub-Saharan ancestry, but it's weighted more heavily on the maternal side. Why? Because African women were trafficked into slavery, exploited as laborers, concubines, midwives. Their sons inherited the genome of silence, but their daughters passed it on. Generation after generation, the mother line survived the blade, the brand, the baptism. And yet the father line told another story. A story of dominance, not descent. Of those who came with swords and left only surnames. And then the pattern shifted again. As the 20th century dawned and borders blurred, new migrations arrived with new chromosomal echoes. But this time, the mixing wasn't about conquest. It was about survival. And science would soon reveal how movement, war, and economy rewired the DNA of modern Mexicans, not just in blood, but in time itself. Because in the 20th century, the conquest didn't come with swords. It came with contracts. From 1942 to 1964, more than 5 million Mexican men crossed the northern border under the Bracero program, a U.S. labor agreement designed to supply agricultural workers during World War II. But what began as temporary migration rewrote entire genomes. DNA tells the part the contracts never did. Genetic studies, including a pivotal 2018 paper by Gigno et al., show something few expected. Instead of diluting indigenous ancestry, northbound migration preserved it. Between the 1940s and the 1990s, Amerindigenous DNA actually increased in Mexican-American populations. Why? Because the people who moved weren't elites. They were rural, from Oaxaca, Chiapas, Michoacán. entire regions where native ancestry remained strong. Their migration, their marriages, their children, born on both sides of the border, carried that DNA with them. And yet, as families settled in cities like Los Angeles, Houston, and Chicago, their oral stories changed. We're Spanish. We're Mestizo. We're just Mexican. But the tests said otherwise. In one study published in Nature Communications, 2021, researchers found regional genetic signatures, unique patterns from Jalisco, Puebla, and Guerrero still clearly visible in second- and third-generation Mexican Americans, ancestry that refused to be erased, even by distance. But this wasn't just an international story. Inside Mexico, too, the revolution and what followed reshaped the bloodline map. The Mexican Revolution, 1910, 1920, broke apart large estates and scattered rural families. Internal migration surged. Cities swelled. And when the U.S. deported nearly 500,000 Mexican nationals during the 1930s Great Depression, some families returned to villages they'd left. Others never did. Genetic drift, the random rise or fall of certain markers, accelerated. Populations mixed not through empire, but through survival. Through train routes, factory jobs, collapsed sugar plantations. By the 1980s, the Mexican genome was no longer just indigenous, European, or African. It was shaped by highways, by passports, by seasonal labor. But then, something changed again. Because in the 21st century, it wasn't wars or borders that challenged identity. It was a cheek swab. Because when you order a DNA kit expecting family pride, and it reveals a secret your grandfather never spoke about, what do you believe? The story he told, or the blood in your mouth? Because for generations, the story was simple. Proud Spanish ancestors, maybe some indigenous lineage, far back, wrapped in myth. No one mentioned anything else, until the DNA said something different. In 2016, a man in Monterrey took a test just for fun. His family, proudly Castilian, traced their surname back to Salamanca. Dinner table stories always circled the same noble root. But the results told another story. 2% sub-Saharan African ancestry, and more than 50% indigenous. Confused, he traced it back through his uncle's side. Church records in Coahuila from 1798 showed a baptism entry his great-great-great-grandmother listed simply as una mulata libre, a free woman of color, a name no one had spoken in 2 centuries. Her blood, forgotten. Her children, renamed. Her truth, buried under generations of silence. He stared at the screen and felt something shift. These stories are multiplying. Across the country and in the diaspora, people take tests expecting pride and instead receive puzzles. A family in Guadalajara discovers Filipino ancestry through haplogroup M, common in Southeast Asia, dated to arrivals from the Manila Galleon. A woman in Veracruz finds Bantu DNA from Angola, confirmed by mitochondrial lineage tracing back to the 1600s. It's not just discovery, it's confrontation, because the body doesn't forget what the family buried, and once revealed, the genome becomes rebellion. A quiet uprising against curated identity, a crack in the mirror. Suddenly, school books feel wrong. Last names feel like masks. And history, once flat, becomes alive, loud, conflicted, real. In a study published in Nature, 2020, over 6,000 Mexican genomes were analyzed. Results showed not just diversity, but mismatch. People who identified as white had high indigenous ancestry. Others who saw themselves as purely native had African or Asian signals hiding inside. And that gap between who you think you are and what your body says you've inherited, that's where the reckoning begins. But these revelations weren't just emotional. They were medical. Because hidden inside that indigenous or African DNA were clues to survival or risk, codes for disease or protection. And the next question wasn't, who am I? It was, will this save my life? Because when your doctor reads your DNA, what they see can be the difference between healing and harm. In a study published in Cell, 2020, over 6,000 genomes from Mexico were analyzed. And the results weren't just historical, they were urgent. Researchers found that people from different regions of Mexico, though all considered mestizo, have wildly different medical risk profiles. A mestizo from Oaxaca doesn't process medicine the same way as someone from Jalisco. A person from Yucatan might face different risks for obesity, lung capacity, or diabetes compared to someone raised in the mountains of Durango. One example shook the medical field. A test of lung function measured by FEV1 scores revealed that mestizo men from western Mexico had, on average, younger lung profiles than those from the southeast, not because of pollution, not because of age, but because of native ancestry specific to region. Another shock came from drug metabolism genes. Variants in CYP2D6 and CYP2C9 enzymes responsible for breaking down many common drugs differ sharply across Mexican populations. That means a painkiller dose that works in Mexico City might overwhelm someone in Chiapas. A standard chemotherapy plan could be fatal if the patient carries the wrong metabolizing variant. And yet, in clinics across North America, doctors still use one box, Latino. But Latino means nothing to the body. It erases Nahua from Maya, Zapotec from Purepecha, Sonoran Rancher from Afro-Mexican farmer. It assumes that centuries of conquest, survival, and migration add up to one biological profile. It doesn't. Medical anthropologist Dr. Andres Moreno Estrada called it out clearly. We must abandon the idea of a single Latino genome, or people will die from treatments not meant for their DNA. Because precision medicine isn't about the color of your skin or the name on your ID. It's about the silent instructions coded in your cells. And Mexico's genome? It's not one story, it's 1,000. The mestizo myth may unify culture, but medically, it misleads. And somewhere beneath all those layers, there's still one last question. If your body holds a history no one taught you, what does your identity become when the test says, you were never who you thought you were? Because DNA doesn't just whisper facts. It shouts contradictions. And in Mexico, that contradiction goes to the core of nationhood itself. For over a century, mestizage was a story of unity. A powerful, poetic myth that said, we are one race, forged from many. Indigenous roots, Spanish legacy, mixed proudly, beautifully, equally. But the genome says, no, not quite. In 2020, when researchers from the National Institute of Genomic Medicine released their findings, the story began to fray. Mexico's genetic landscape wasn't a melting pot, it was a mosaic. Each region, each town, sometimes each family carried different histories beneath their skin. And the differences weren't just heritage, they were survival. The myth of mestizage erased what the genome has preserved. It flattened Afro-Mexican voices into footnotes. It blurred indigenous nations over 68 living languages into a single native past. It left out the Filipino dock workers of Acapulco, the Chinese railroad builders, the Jewish merchants of Veracruz, the Basque refugees of the Spanish Civil War, and yet somehow their DNA endured. In mitochondrial lineages like A2, B2, and L3, we find resistance. In Y chromosome haplogroups like E1B1A, R1b, and QM3, we find memory. Buried in gene variants, rare diseases, even eye color, we find stories that no textbook ever bothered to write. So what is Mexican identity really? It's not a blend. It's a map, a conflict, a survival, a reunion of bloodlines that were never meant to meet but did. Under conquest, in silence, through resilience. And maybe that's what the genome truly is, not just a test, but a return. To truths that were hidden, to voices that were silenced, to ancestors finally named. But if this is what lies beneath the skin of one nation, if Mexico's genome rewrote its own history, then what about the rest? Because the blood is speaking in Colombia, in Peru, in the Dominican Republic, and Latin America's DNA has only just begun to speak.